Welcome to Protecting Honesty in Education, a program from the League of Women Voters of Ohio. I'm Karen Leith. I chair the State Advocacy Committee, and I am delighted to have all of you in attendance. We have an incredible set of speakers for tonight. I'm not only a member of LWV Ohio's board, but also here in Hudson, and I am part of the Real Talk Committee. Our talk tonight in terms of honesty in education is very important to all of us, and we will be looking at the three challenges facing honesty in education: the Statehouse, the State Board of Education, and local school districts. Our guest speaker tonight is an expert on critical race theory and unpacking white privilege. And we will be talking with a student, an administrator, and a state school board member who will join our speaker in a panel to look at the impact this is having on everyone. And it does affect everyone. So we are going to begin by talking about these three challenges, and I'd like to introduce Cynthia Peoples. Cynthia also is a member of both LWVO and LWV Hudson, where she focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion, advocacy, and communications. Currently, she is the coordinator of her efforts regarding advocacy around DEI and honesty in education. She has quite an extensive bio in nonprofits, and I just love working with her. So I'm at this point going to turn it over to Cynthia.
Thank you, Karen, and good evening, everyone. In opening this program, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and ground all of our leaguers in the program tonight, ground them in the discussion by initially reviewing our own positions and priorities that do address diversity, equity, and inclusion in education. And here on the screen, taking a look at League of Ohio's agenda for action, this essentially guides our advocacy. We can see that the primary responsibility of the State Board of Education is setting that policy and planning, while the Department of Education is administrative and regulatory. And that is how we view those two bodies. And then quickly looking at League's state education standards, we do support the use of state education standards as a method of requiring high quality education, and that the state board establishes clear guidelines for any exceptions to those state education standards. And this is an important note, especially in terms of changing education standards and the local control of districts to operationalize those standards. And in terms of equity in education, we do identify that learning assessment should not be the only measure of academic progress, but we should also be looking at helping teachers modify instruction for students who have needs for additional support. And then looking at the equality of opportunity position of LWVUS on a national landscape, League also believes that all levels of government bear the responsibility of providing equal access to quality education. And those two words, equality and quality, are inextricably, linked in that statement. And this position also supports increased educational opportunities for disadvantaged groups, again, looking at equity, and programs that inform individuals of their civil rights in education, and also looking at carefully tailored programming that it is also carried out by competent, trained personnel. And then, of course, the overarching goal is to assist students in becoming self-supporting, contributing members of society. And looking at those three challenges facing honesty and education across the country, what we're seeing right now is that at least 26 states have introduced bills or taken other steps at their boards of education and local school districts to restrict and limit how educators discuss race, racism, sex, and sexism, and critical race theory. At least 12 states have enacted those bans, either legislatively or at their state boards of ed or their local school districts, with more actions pending. I just want to remind 26 states across the country, that's more than half the country, is trying to operationalize these efforts. And in May, 20 attorneys generals signed on to a letter to the US Department of Education opposing the use of 2 grant programs that they claimed ushered in critical race theory and the 1619 Project into our state's classrooms. And Attorney General David Yost, our own Attorney General, was one of those sign-ons. And in growing circles around the country and here in Ohio, critical race theory has become an erroneous catch-all for any discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion in education, anti-racism, and inclusive curriculum. And as more districts are embracing cultural proficiency, affirming those identities, and empowering students, we're seeing that critical race theory has been used to oppose it. And we will hear more on that in just a bit. And in May of this year, in our own Ohio Statehouse, 2 House bills prohibiting the promotion of divisive concepts were introduced in Ohio. Those would be House Bill 327 and 322. And these bills are very similar in language to those pending and passed legislation bills across the country that we just spoke about. Reps Diane Grandel and Sarah Fowler Arthur are the primary sponsors for 327, while Representative Don Jones is the primary sponsor for 322. Interestingly, both bills were placed in the state and local government committees and heard proponent testimony in June, just before the recess. We do anticipate opponent testimony in the fall or winter. Just a note, the General Assembly does reconvene in September, with the Senate on September 8th and the House on September 5th. Excuse me, 15th. And as you can see here, looking at the screen, the bills, the language and the spirit are very similar. However, in terms of their scope and their punitive measures, they are a bit different. 327 targets K-12, higher ed, and political subdivisions, while 322 only targets K-12. And we do want to note that K-12 does include our STEM schools and our community schools. And just looking quickly at what these bills actually do prohibit, and what they do prohibit, it is pretty similar. Looking at the State Board of Education, it does prohibit the state board from adopting any curriculum or standards that are promoting divisive concepts. It also prohibits school district boards from selecting any textbook, instructional material, or academic curriculum that also promotes divisive concepts. And then it also prohibits that teaching, instructing, training, advocating, or promoting of divisive concepts. And then looking at course credits, it also prohibits awarding credit towards high school graduation for subject matter or courses that promote divisive concepts, also requiring a student to advocate for or against a specific topic or point of view to receive credit for coursework or graduation. And then looking at that training and professional development, promotion of divisive concepts is prohibited in that professional development. And then looking at expenditures, applying for any federal grants to develop or select a curriculum, purchase course material, or provide teacher training for a course about divisive concepts is prohibited, as well as the acceptance of private funding for those same purposes. So we can see that the prohibitions are similar. Again, where they differ now, 327 levies some pretty harsh penalties for violations of those prohibitions. The first, second, and third punitive measures for school districts and schools would be 25 to 50 to 100% withholding of state funding. And then for our administrators, our supers, principals, and educators for first, second, and third violation, they receive an admonishment of their professional license, a suspension of their professional license, and then finally for that third violation, a revocation of their professional license. So the penalties are very steep. What I do want to let you know is there is a lot more detail about these bills available on the LWVO Advocacy, Honesty, and Education site. We don't have enough time tonight to go into, high definition detail, but these are certainly the highlights of the bill. Next slide. And then looking at what's happening in our State Board of Education. In July of 2020, the State Board of Education passed the resolution to condemn racism and advance equity and opportunity for Black students, Indigenous students, and students of color. And this resolution passed by a 12-5 vote with 1 abstention. And this resolution is extremely comprehensive, and it provides a framework for Ohio's 600 plus school districts to really dig into that equity in a meaningful and sustainable way. It addresses, as you can see here on the screen, disparities in academic performance, disproportionate discipline of Black male students, systemic inequity in under-resourced schools. It calls out racism, bigotry, and hatred. And most importantly here, it looks at the need for internal examination of district operations to identify inequities. And some of those examinations include examining biases in academic standards, model curriculum, state testing, curriculum, hiring, training, development, and student discipline. And since the adoption, there has been opposition to the resolution and its tenets. And in addition to this opposition, there has been some pretty aggressive public comments at the State Board of Education meetings. And then even within the State Board of Education, we've had a few of the board members that are actively opposing the resolution as well. Last month, board member John Hagan proposed his own resolution requesting a formal opinion from Attorney General David Yost to offer his opinion about the legal authority or lack thereof of the resolution to condemn racism. And that resolution did end up passing with some significant amendments to the actual language and tone. The board is now awaiting for that formal opinion from AG Yost. And while we're on the screen quickly, I do want to pull your attention to the ongoing state level diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. This resolution was not a one-off. There has been years of diversity, equity, and inclusion building within the ODE, the Ohio Department of Ed, and the State Board of Education. If you look at their 5-year strategic plan, it is built and layered with initiatives driving diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it offers hard data and research to support why those initiatives are critical for Ohio schools, the students, and the staff. And if you look at the diversifying the education profession in Ohio, this is a roadmap to address the lack of representation that is highlighted in the strategic plan. You know, talking about the representation among students versus teachers of color throughout the state of Ohio. And then also looking at the each child means each child framework that employs the visions and principles of the strategic plan, again, to address specific needs for our students with disabilities. Next slide. Then taking a look at what's happening in our local districts. So over the past several months, there has been growing concern and opposition to diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in our local school districts. And this has really been manifesting at school board meetings, in records requests that we've been seeing in a lot of our administrative offices, wanting to know about what is being taught as far as critical race theory goes in the school districts. And some community members are going so far as to ask for in-class cameras so that they can monitor not only what is being taught, but how it is being taught. And as you can see here with this chart, much of the opposition is really based on a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the importance of anti-racism, and the importance of anti-bias training, and how it actually impacts the student experience and student learning. And there has been a long-standing effort and initiative for equity in education. This is not new. This did not just come up within the last year. It has been decades in practice, both in principle and in operationalizing those efforts. Next slide. And I'm just giving you a little bit of a teaser. At the bottom of the program, we are going to walk through different ways that you can take action at the Statehouse, at the State Board of Education, and in our local school districts. And I do encourage you to kind of follow the program by walking through the LWVO page. A lot of the content that I just spoke about is gone through in high definition on that website. Nazak put that up. She did a beautiful job on building that. There's a lot of content there. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Karen. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. As you can see, there's a lot going on, and we have designed this program to help give you some of the tools you need and the language you need and the knowledge you need to work in this take action. Now, before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'm going to remind you that this is being recorded. You will be sent a link to the recording as well as copies of the slides. I know especially the slides that Cynthia just went through are jam-packed with information. If you have questions as the program progresses, please put them in the Q&A. We will be monitoring the Q&A and work your questions into our question period. In fact, after our distinguished speaker, Dr. Junkus, speaks, we are going to allot about 10 minutes worth of questions just on his presentation before we invite the other panelists on. We have Michael Barron, who's putting links in the chat. I have truncated the CVs of our distinguished guests tonight because they were very long, but we will be dropping links to their incredible background in the chat. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Vince Junkuns. He is an associate professor of political science, provost awarded transformative faculty member, dean's outstanding teacher, and university professor at Ohio University. With degrees in history and political science from Ohio Dominican, Ohio University, and then his PhD from the University of Washington, he teaches a wide range of courses, including critical race theory, democratic theory, law and society, political theory, and American politics. You can see he's very well qualified to be our speaker tonight. His theorizing, research, and writing have focused on these topics of critical race theory, whiteness, anti-Blackness studies, democratic theory, critical resistance to mass incarceration in American politics. He's a popular professor. I looked up his rating by his students. I love to do that, having taught myself. And Dr. Junkus' writing has appeared in some of the top journals in political science and political theory, including the Journal of Public Deliberation, the Journal of Politics, New Political Science, and Contemporary Political Theory. The link in the chat will probably take you to his CV, which has an incredible listing. He has co-authored a couple of books, and he has a forthcoming book, Engaging Political Theory, Transformative Critiques and Vision for a Better World, and is currently writing a 5-volume work, The Contemporary White Supremacy Project in America, with the first volume being White by Force. Dr. Junkuns has been battling this misinformation from the political right regarding equity, inclusion, diversity, and critical race theory, including writing op-eds in the Washington Post. He's been a national and international voice for critical race theory and diversity, having been interviewed and appearing on CBS This Morning, BBC Radio International, the Columbus Dispatch, the Ohio Catholic Journal, and the New Era. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our very distinguished guest tonight. I'm looking very forward to his presentation, Dr. Vince Junkuns. Vince?
Sorry, I was still muted. Thank you so much for that introduction. boy, it sounds really good. Whenever I do anything, I tell my 9-year-old daughter about it. She's sort of like, oh, okay. Does it have anything to do with, you know, Pig plus Cat or, you know, one of her television shows? I'm like, I say no, and she's like, well, okay. But that sounded, oh, I sounded quite good. So I want to start with my daughter. And I had this this quote from this sociologist, Sigmund Bauman. And he talked about, he wrote this book, Modernity and the Holocaust, which is a really great book, by the way. And in it, he has several definitions of racism, but one is this idea that human beings are before they speak and before they act. And anything that a person might do will not change that. And so I'll start with my daughter. So when my daughter was born, St. Patrick's Day of 2012, the best day of my life. It was great, awesome moment. And yet I was reminded within 24 hours some of the struggles she was going to face throughout her life. But she's not, her mother's from Puerto Rico. She's not what you call a white child. So you know, so we start our lives with our daughter, and she's having trouble getting food. She's having trouble getting breast milk, and so we called in the lactation consultant at St. Anne's, and my daughter is crying. She's really crying quite loudly. And the person came in, and the first thing they said was that, you know, ooh, she has a temper. She must have that Hispanic temper. And, you know, I was taken aback, and what we ended up doing is calling in our own lactation consultant from outside the hospital, who came in and saved the day for us, which was amazing. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. And then a couple weeks later, my sister was diagnosed with cancer, and being a cancer survivor myself, I wanted everyone to meet at my parents' house to show her some support. So new parents, we run out the door without the diaper bag, okay? And so, you know, one of those mistakes. And we get over to my parents' house, and of course, you know, my daughter has to have, you know, little action in her diaper. She goes to the bathroom in a diaper. I guess that's not the way to say it. She's, you know, whatever. And we don't have a diaper. So she starts crying. And we're trying to figure out a way, you know, trying to find a diaper somewhere in my parents' house. Given they have like 25 grandchildren, we figure we find one somewhere. But while we're in the middle of trying to do that, we find one, we bring it up to put on my daughter, and she's still crying. My dad says, in front of like 30 people, boy, she's got that Hispanic temper. And, you know, I was just like, you know, no, babies don't have tempers. And that's appropriate. He was like, no, she's got that Hispanic temper, just like her mother. And my wife looked at him and gave him a pretty strong look. And he said, there, see? So this is a story that says quite a bit, but a person is before they speak and before they act. My daughter was designated as having a 24 hours had come and gone in her life. And within 2 weeks that she was designated as such. And, you know, that stuck with her for quite a while with my dad. Anytime she would fuss at all, he would go back to this temper issue. So, you know, racism has many forms, and these are some of the things that happen that perpetuate stereotypes in everyday life, even among people who call themselves not racist. So I'm a critical race theorist, and the first thing I'll do is talk a little bit about what that means, and with just some introductory comments. So critical race theory, the way I define it is that it's a look at contemporary racism, and we look at contemporary racism and study it to think about ways we can dismantle these injustices. And our goal is to close the gap between what America professes for everyone and what we actually have occurring. So it's, to me, critical race theory has always been as American as apple pie, so to speak, because it's, to me, it's very patriotic. Patriotism, in my view, is about fulfilling the obligations, the duties, and the promises and rights that are given to us in our founding documents and other places. Critical race theory is not about trying to make white people feel guilty. It's not about blaming individual white people for racism. That, for us, for critical race theorists, that sort of misses the point. Because racism for us is a broader phenomenon than just individual people making awful comments or doing awful things based on their racial hatred. It's much more than that. And so we focus on things that don't have to do with individuals per se, and to try and understand how racism has adapted after the civil rights movement. So we'll move on to the next slide, and I want to talk a little bit about where critical race theory came from. So this, I'm gonna give you like a really fast, speed action here, historical account to give you the context out of which it emerged. So critical race theorists, there are people who were in the civil rights movement, civil rights lawyers like Derek Bell, who was considered the founder of critical race theory, who very much was active in many of the civil rights cases from the civil rights movement. And then in the 70s, he started to look at things and he said, we seemingly have had all this progress through law, but we're not seeing that come to fruition in everyday life. So he started to think about, well, what's happened here? Why is this taking place? Now, let me give you some historical context regarding race in America and its link to law. So the Constitution, there are several parts of the Constitution that protect slavery. So it's embedded in the founding document. And then we go through the Civil War, and we have what's called sort of the Civil Rights Amendments to the Constitution, 13th, 14th, and 15th. 13th banning slavery, 14th equal protection under the law, and 15th voting rights. And then right after, in the South in particular, they found a way to get around the 13th Amendment, because the 13th Amendment allowed that you could basically keep a person as a slave if they broke a law. And you have the emergence of what's called convict leasing. So these private companies would basically pay an amount of money to lease prisoners to do work on their various companies. And this labor was horrific. The standards were horrific. It was, if you read, there's some accounts of the experience of convict leasing, and they're horrific. They're just awful. But it was basically another form of slavery, getting around the 13th Amendment. And it's a great movie called 13th, and it's about how that has also come to fruition throughout our entire history into New Jim Crow. Then we have Plessy versus Ferguson. So this is a case where that brought us separate but equal, which was always unequal. So that set up this system of apartheid in the United States and Jim Crow. So we have the law again giving its weight to racism. Then we have Brown versus Board, which people looked at very fondly for good reason, which said that segregation is inherently unequal, and this was about education. And so we have this is 1954. And then we have 14 years, what's called the era of Great Resistance, where schools across the country refused to integrate. And then in 68, the court comes along and they say, we need to get rid of this all deliberate speed, do more aggressive ways to integrate. So as they do that, we have white flight. So white people who don't want to integrate flee to the suburbs with the development of the interstate system. And so what you end up having is these districts and cities that have very few white people. So in Detroit, the district judge found that to integrate, you had to do inter-district busing. busing from the suburbs into the city and vice versa. Well, this became an issue and went to the Supreme Court in Milliken versus Bradley. And the court said that in order to have a remedy for segregation, there has to be a wrong. And they said, the new districts in the suburbs don't have any policies of discrimination. Therefore, we can't order them to sort of integrate. There is no wrong per se. So we have this case, that was like 1975. We have like 7 years where the courts were aggressive. And then the Supreme Court basically came along and said, well, people have segregated themselves into suburbs and such, and really there's no wrong in that. So there's nothing for us to remedy. So for the next slide, what I'll talk about is these legal concepts that emerged after the civil rights movement, and how they emerged in a way that made it very difficult for us to tackle racism. So there are a series of dichotomies. So de jure and de facto is just by law or in the law and in fact. So then you have this division between law and society. So there's discrimination in law. And what we ended up doing is focusing on how getting rid of that discrimination, but that did not change or transform the inequalities in society. This will become important in a minute. We also have this distinction between intent and impact. Is discrimination about intentional discrimination, or is it that we can see these inequalities in society, an impact or a victim? And so you can see these things are just very different perspectives. You can focus on one or the other. You can do a combination. When we think about equality, this dichotomy emerged by equality of opportunity, equality of results. And then with equity, a wrong must have a remedy, but in order to have a remedy, you must have a wrong. Okay. So these dichotomies emerged in ways that made it very difficult for people who experience discrimination to bring lawsuits and bring evidence to prove discrimination. Because in each case, the justices who developed this jurisprudence around race ended up falling on the sort of, you have to have discrimination in law, you have to have intentional discrimination, you have to show a perpetrator. And that's a very difficult thing to do after the civil rights movement, when people are more cautious about discriminating. They're not usually going to write in a memo or something like that. And in our age, they're not going to put in a text or an email, usually, that they want to discriminate. So the other thing is that these thoughts about legal concepts very much reflected white biases at the time. So these are things to think about. I'm not going to go into detail, but we think about things like reasonable force when discussing police and police force, use of force. How might that reasonableness affect and be impacted by white consciousness, in a society where we have seen a great deal of brutality against Black and brown bodies. And there's a way in which reasonableness is different and is shaped by these white biases that have been going on for many, many years. What counts as evidence of racism? How do white people perceive threat? When I say white people, it's very general. I'm being very general. So I'm not talking about specific white people. All these things have an impact on how law emerges around race. So next slide. So this is just an example. So the court decided they could do a perpetrator or victim perspective. Perpetrator perspective is what they decided to focus on. So in order to prove discrimination, for instance, under the 14th Amendment or Civil Rights Act, the person trying to prove discrimination has to show there is a perpetrator, that there is a individual or group who have demonstrated overt, articulated attitudes and intentions to discriminate. There must be some smoking gun, a memo, policy, text, email, comment. So the assumption there is that intent can only be truly known via expression, which in a way is true. How can we ever know what a person's intent is? So when you say that we have to show intent, and that intent has to be expressed, like I said, that becomes very, very difficult to prove in the post-civil rights era, civil rights movement. The victim perspective is an alternative. With this, showing inequalities in society, would be enough to say that there are injustices or unfairness within institutions. So real quick, hypothetical, let's say that Columbus has 50% Black population. This is hypothetical. The limited brand, emerged in Columbus. Let's say that they only hire 7% of their managers are Black, but they exist in a context which is 50% Black. So if a victim perspective would be to look at that and to say, well, there's something going on here. There's an inequality related to who's being hired as managers at the limited, and we think to ourselves, well, because there's inequality, there must be some sort of inequity. Inequity has to do with fairness, treating people in similar situations similarly. And so showing that there's an inequality would be enough for the courts to say, we have to intervene here. So it's a major difference. Well, we focus on perpetrator, which has made it very, very difficult for us to prove discrimination and to tackle it through law. And this is what critical race theorists focus on. So we go to the next slide. So some of the core assumptions and tenets of critical race theory. So given all the stuff I just went through really quickly, we want to broaden what's considered within the scope of justice, what we consider to be justice, just and just, and to take account for voices that have been typically excluded. Critical race theory also assumes that racism is normal, that anti-racism would be abnormal. And part of that links up to the fact that in the 70s, after the Civil Rights Movement, we quickly moved away from sort of interrogating white identity. And I could talk about that, it would take a little bit of time, but we never really held it to account. This identity that participated in all the racism for hundreds of years, we never really held it to account in a very strong way or substantive way. There are other concepts like interest convergence, which says that the only time white people in general or politicians get behind something that would benefit people of color is when it benefits them. An example would be during the Cold War, when America is fighting the Soviet Union, it looked bad that we had this apartheid at home. So politicians got behind Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Act, as a way to make us look better in the Cold War. And that actually was their intention. That's an example of interest convergence. And I'll talk more about some of the other concepts as we go down further. So if we go to the next slide. So this is a list of different forms of racism in our contemporary setting. And I'm going to give you an example which will touch on many of these. But first, white supremacy, we have to think about it in at least two ways. One is an ideology which says white people are somehow better than. And then two, as a material manifestation of that ideology, where we see that socioeconomic benefits, material realities are unequal. Those two combine, interact with each other and perpetuate this white supremacy. Now, contemporary forms of racism, I'm going to give you a quick example for a story. So the time is going quicker, but I'll try to do my best. A relative of mine who moved to New Albany years ago in Columbus, sort of a wealthy area. Their family is Black. She's Black, her husband. She has two kids, and she has a Black son who was in school in New Albany, second grade. And this is a very shy, quiet child. She received a phone call from a teacher saying that they wanted to put him on a special ed track. And she was really confused, like, how is this possible? There are tons of teachers in the family. She's a teacher, her mother's a teacher, her sisters, all these teachers. And so she knew that her son was in quite good shape. Anyway, she meets with the teacher the first time, and the teacher will not listen to anything she has to say, refuses to retest or reconsider, and insists that, we're going to go forward with this. Then my this relative of mine calls for a meeting with the principal and the teacher, and this time she brings her white stepmother, who's also an educator. During that meeting, you have the white principal, white teacher, the mother who's Black, and the white grandmother who's white, And in that meeting, they listened to the white grandmother and her claim that, you know, there's nothing wrong with him, he's just shy, because the white teacher interpreted his shyness as his whiteness as sort of some sort of anger, aggression, which is a stereotype about Black men. And so they listen to the grandmother, they retest him, find that he tests, you know, ahead of his grade level in reading, that there is nothing, you know, to worry about with anger. Now so he, you know, everything was fine, but it wasn't. But it was fine, but it wasn't. Now, this brings together all kinds of different forms of racism, unconscious racism. So the teacher may have been thinking about this young Black boy as being sort of angry due to the ways in which we have been socialized to think about Black men in our country. It brings together institutional racism, because we know that Black children are much more likely to be put in special ed tracks. So that's, you know, this is institutional racism. It brings forward all these different intersections of racism. So let's go on to let's go next slide. And then another slide, I'm sorry, I'm gonna skip this and go one more. And one more. So I want to talk about white privilege real quick. I was going to talk about the context out of which this misconfiguration of critical race theory emerged, but you know, that's something we can talk about. You know, you could probably imagine for yourself. We live in a very post-truth society in which people lost their common values. So white privilege. So you know, I got married when I was 22 to a Black woman, and when we met, we were rejected by everybody. So my parents said she couldn't come into our house. Her mother said I couldn't come into her house for totally different reasons. You know, in her side, it was a matter of trust. You know, this is a white man. How can we trust him to date our daughter? But with my parents, it was like, you know, their first thing was, well, you know, how are your kids going to be affected? And I remember this is when they found out we were dating. We've been dating for like 2 weeks, and they're bringing up kids. And I was like, you guys are so worried that you're going to have a Black grandchild. It's crazy. But so we were married for quite a while, and our marriage was almost a sociological context where we would see all the time white privilege play out. So I'll just give you a couple quick examples. We traveled a lot, and we went back and forth to Seattle because we went to graduate school out there. And we found that when we would stop for a hotel room, there was a day we stopped for a hotel room. End of the day, April goes in to get a room, and they tell her they have no rooms. She comes out and she tells me that. I said, I gotta go to the restroom. So I go to the restroom, and then I come to the desk and I say, do you guys have rooms? Does anything open up? And they're like, oh, we have several rooms, and this is the price, and all this stuff. And you know, when I questioned them, they were like, oh, well, maybe it was a misunderstanding with their wife. I was like, well, it was 10 minutes earlier. But my wife was, you know, told there were no rooms. I was told there were rooms. So we started to test this out. We found that this happened all the time. She would go into a hotel in Montana. Many times she was either told there wasn't a room, or she was quoted a price that was quite high. I go into the same hotel, there's a room, and I would get you know, let's say $80 for a night, where she was told 120. Now, this was a regular thing. And this is an example of white privilege. I didn't earn that. It's something that came to me by nature of being white. And this occurred not just, it occurred in retail, it occurred when renting apartments and going looking for jobs. It occurred when we were both graduate students. We were both treated differently. It was a deep and broad part of my life. And so one of the things we have to think about, if you want to go to the next slide and I'll wrap up, is that white privilege is sort of this set of possibilities and access points that are unearned, but we have just because we're white. Now, this is a real thing. And if you're a white person who has never had a personal relationship with someone, a person of color to contrast with, you may not understand it. You may not see it in your life. but it's very much a part of our lives as white people. One more case, I had a nephew who lived in Bexley and got in a car and was driving down like Drexel Avenue, going like 50 miles an hour, wrecked the car. The police came and his parents came, and they're going over what's happening. And, you know, he was reckless driving, alcohol involved. And the police talked to my sister, and she's like trying to talk them into, you know, not doing anything. And the police officer says, you know, he looks like an all-American. He seems like a really good kid. I would hate to do anything that could harm his future, and lets him off with nothing. This happened to a second nephew as well. I can tell you just with my relationship with April that, you know, her brothers and our nephews and such did not get that kind of treatment as Black men in this country. These are huge things over time, and they lead to institutional inequalities within our prison system, within our educational system. They matter. One last slide is this major myths about white privilege and misunderstandings. One misunderstanding on the next slide is that white people don't suffer. Of course, white people suffer. Another misunderstanding is that people think that white privilege means that white people never earned anything themselves, or they don't work hard for what they get. That's not true. Of course, white people work hard for what they get. White people can be victims of other forms of privilege, gendered privilege, for instance. All people struggle, white people struggle. They do suffer. But as a white person, we gain access to things because we're white that others don't. And it's something we have to really think a lot about to try and dismantle it.
Thank you,
So, I'm out of time.
Dr.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Young-Kuntz. And with that, we're going to open it up to the rest of our panelists. Joining us, we have Merle Johnson, who's a retired teacher with 40 years of teaching experience in the Cleveland Public Schools. Ms. Johnson was originally elected to the school board in November of 2016 and then re-elected in November of 2020 for District 11. She is an avid student advocate. She has worked with new and struggling teachers. And right now, I love the fact that she has taught Upward Bound, a program very dear to my heart. I have taught in Upward Bound programs. And she hosts a weekly radio show called It's About Justice. Also joining us is Dr. Andrea Celico, who is the superintendent of the Bedford City Schools. She became that superintendent in August of 2015. With experience in education, both at the elementary and secondary levels. She actually began her career as a teacher in Euclid City Schools, serving also as assistant principal, and assistant superintendent in her 17 years with Euclid. She has served as assistant superintendent of the educational services in Cleveland Heights University Heights School District before moving to the Bedford City Schools. She has numerous leadership positions, and again, her link will be dropped in the chat. And our last panelist, I am absolutely delighted to meet tonight for the first time, is Kaya Woodford. Kaya is a recent graduate of Bexley High School and lives currently only 15 minutes from her small suburban town. She currently is a student at Ohio State University. Congratulations, Kaya. She is a recipient of the Morrell Scholarship and actually works as an advisor to the program. But the important piece about Kaya is her activism. With other BHS alumni, Kaya recently founded and serves as president of the Bexley Anti-Racism Project, which is a collective community organization serving to educate, mobilize, and amplify Black voices within the community of Bexley, as well as resources nationwide. Our guests are very interesting. Merle's was very instrumental in the racism resolution that came out of our state school board. Dr. Basically Celico works in a system that has a large African-American population and has been incredibly involved in DEI work in that population. And Kaya's father moved them into Bexley because of the school system, and it's a predominantly wealthy white suburb of Columbus. So we've got an interesting mix here. And I'd like to start with an important question, because as I watch school board meetings, the term equity keeps coming up. And, misunderstanding of what we mean with equity. And Dr. Celico, I went back and really listened to when you, for Real Talk, had explained what was going on in the Bedford city schools, and you started with the term equity and building equity for all the students. So I'm going to start with you. How do you define equity?
Thank you. Well, in our district, we have been focusing for a number of years on equity, and we've had extensive training and professional development around the topic. And essentially, people confuse equality and equity very frequently. And the difference with equality, and giving everybody equal treatment, right? The same thing. Where equity is meeting people, our definition and how we treat it is meeting people where they are at, and then providing those resources that they need to afford them the same opportunities that people are privileged of having. So we're trying to address those needs of people and meeting them where they're at. And there's an excellent graphic. I don't know if people have seen it, but it's about, there's three, I think, children and adults looking over a fence, and they're trying to view a baseball game. And one is tiny, one is, medium height, and one is tall. So one doesn't need any type of support, whereas the little one needs 2 boxes to stand on, and the medium one needs 1 box, and the other person needs no supports at all to see. So that's a graphic that we have used and we've discussed, and how we can find ways to provide those resources and give students or families what they need, and just meeting them where they're at.
Kaya, I'd like you to weigh in on that, as a student, how you became very active in terms of what went on in the Bexley school system. How does the term equity relate to you, and how would you define it?
Certainly. I am additionally part of the Swell Summer Work Experience in Law Scholars Program, and I think that's the perfect example of functional equity. And I think the functionality piece is extremely important in conversations regarding DE&I work, because it's one thing to know the definition of a word, however, it's different to practice what you're preaching. So I believe it's important that we think about these terms and use them in a practical manner. So the Swell Scholars Program is a program that's designed to support students of minority backgrounds who are interested in the legal field, interested in pursuing careers in the legal field. And it supports them by providing them sponsors, which are legal professionals who are established in their careers, and they open doors for them and allow them to intern at firms. I'm working with Littler Mendelsohn, which is the world's largest employment and labor law firm. And I was awarded the opportunity as a result of my membership to the Swell Scholars Program. And so through that, I'm able to have the advantages awarded to some students I attended Bexley High School with, who are fortunate to have family connections to some big firms and gain that experience and exposure as a result of their family background and privilege on account of their race. In addition to placements at firms, Swell Scholars are additionally able to attend weekly seminars to learn more about the field and the practice of law. So in my mind, and the purpose of the program is to address those deficits that occur as a result of marginalization and the denial of opportunity previously on account of my being Black and my other peers being Black in racialized United States. So that's my definition of functional equity. And I'm just so thankful and feel fortunately to be part of the Swell Scholars Program. In regard to Bexley specifically, I think the issue there isn't necessarily a complete lack of diversity, although we don't have the largest population of diverse students. However, it's where you will find those diverse populations of students, and it won't be in the AP honors courses, and that's the issue. So, and from the lens of equity, we need to provide those students the resources and also equip them with the information to enroll in those classes at the start of their high school career.
Thanks, that was excellent. Merle, the state board with the resolution and, and the strategic plan, equity was very important. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation, Legal Women Voters, for being here. One of the things that we did in developing the strategic plan is we did a number of regional meetings all over the state. And we had 13 altogether. And we did that because we wanted the strategic plan not just to be our voices at ODE and on the state board, but we wanted to include the voices of other stakeholders throughout the state. And so one of the words that kept coming up when we shared a draft of what we had put together, and people in those various regional meetings looked at it, and one of the things that they were concerned about was that they didn't see enough equity in there. And so the Ohio Department of Education and State Board, we looked at it and we said, okay, we need to put more equity. And now it became a major part of our strategic plan. We represent all 1.8 million students in Ohio, and we have to make sure that all of the students are having the opportunities to be successful. And it's not like that. It has never been like that. And it's my goal and most of our board members' goal to make sure that all of our students have equity and have the same opportunity to be successful.
Thanks, Merle. I'd like to switch a little bit, so that we get some concept of what the impact of these two state bills might have across the board in terms of freedom, academic freedom, etc. I know I've taught at multiple levels. There's always some bias in who presents and what's presented. And as an educator, I've been in the system and, out of the system looking at it to see many, many changes over the years. Given our current discussion, what is honesty in education? I can remember when women were excluded in history textbooks, and I was educated in the 60s, and I saw tremendous changes after the feminist movement in terms of our textbooks. And each year I see a little bit more sort of thing. So I'm going to ask all four of you to speak about that, but from different standpoints. Dr. Celico, I like it from, what you've been doing in the Bedford schools, because it's been absolutely incredible. Ms. Johnson, from the standpoint of state standards, because I love the fact that our state standards are focused on skills and that how to develop skills through the different subject matter. Ms. Woodford, the standpoint of identity and confidence in your future. You're obviously a very confident young woman, and I've worked with young women who didn't have that same confidence. And Dr. Junghans, from the standpoint of the necessity of open exchange in the classroom. So who would like to jump in first? Merle?
I'm not sure what you're asking for when you said as far as state standards. The standards are developed. The districts follow those standards, but the most important thing is because of local control, the districts are able to select the curriculum they want to use, which is something that districts often forget because they reach out to us about curriculum, but they're supposed to be working on the curriculum. But I'm not sure what you're looking for when you talk about state standards. Are you talking about equity, or I'm not sure.
Honesty in education. How do you see standards played out in honesty in education?
Well, one of the things I think is important is that as a member of the Teaching, Leading, and Learning Committee, the standards model curriculum basically comes through us. And that model curriculum is a way to offer guidelines for educators to be able to meet the standards with their curriculum. And as we look through the model curriculum, one of the things I look for is how honest is the curriculum? Is it telling the truth? And for example, when we're looking through the social studies curriculum, and since I'm not an expert in social studies, I reached out to one of my retired friends who was a retired social studies teacher and a brilliant teacher. And he went through and talked about how Reconstruction is not really dealt with the way it should be in our schools, and it still isn't. But he added some things and I added them. But one of the areas of our curriculum that is, from talking to social studies teachers, it's never addressed the way it should be. And that is the area of Reconstruction. The fact that there were 2,000 African Americans elected during that time as elected officials. And it's just a few pages basically in books. So those are the kinds of things that when you talk about standards and model curriculum, I personally look for when we're going through that in our committee.
Thank you. Dr. Celico.
Thank you. I have an extensive list, but in interest of time, I'll kind of rattle through these, and then if there are follow-up questions or anything you want me to expound upon, I'd be glad to do that. Or if people are interested in reaching out, I can explain things more in depth. But again, I would say that when we're talking about honesty, we need to speak our truth, and we don't want to purify history so much so that we lose, the truth and what really has occurred. And so in our district, we've done several things and many things that could be impacted as a result of some of these House bills, et cetera. As we mentioned, we've been talking about diversity and equity and poverty for quite some time. And we are members of a minority recruitment consortium where we recruit minority teachers and administrators. We've been working on the equity work for years. We've sent teams of folks to Wisconsin to receive training there. We've also had an equity audit that we have had completed in our district. And we started with the equity and diversity work, and we kind of morphed into and merged our conversations into more talk around social justice in the last year or so. And that was in the wake of George Floyd's death. And that death was the catalyst for some conversation among our team and a desire to make a change. And so we started our social justice work. We established a mission, vision, a tagline, and logo, which all can be found on our website. I'll just tell you our tagline, which is Bearcats. We're Bedford Bearcats, building bridges to social justice. And again, we have a mission around courageous conversations, a vision, etc. So that too, as I mentioned, can be found on our website. And we also hired a consultant, Pastor Larry Macon Jr. is a diversity consultant that works with us and obviously confers with us on various matters relative to DEI work. And then we've also had numerous professional development opportunities, too many to name. We've had book talks and movie viewings that have played a big part in our community, as well as our staff conversations around race and social justice issues. Just to drop a couple, White Fragility was the book we read. And then we talked earlier about the 13th Amendment. So we watched the movie 13th, as well as America's Son with our staff, as well as our community members. And it just evoked such emotion and expressions from people and just wanting more. We also had, as I mentioned, community forums. So we've held 4 of those last year, all around social justice. We had a Black Lives mural painted, which took a beating over the winter, unfortunately, so we have to start that over. We have members that are going to the Lead Diversity program that is through the Northeast, the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio. And we also have a strategic plan that was created, and our goal in our strategic plan around social justice is that all BCSD stakeholders will be challenged to engage in opportunities that are culturally responsive and eliminate inequities. And then just a couple more things. We have a lead advisory team that is responsible for ensuring that our equity initiatives are followed through. We're working on establishing student groups to empower them and advocate for themselves. And we also have put out, we have an equity policy that our Board of Education did approve. We've also have an anti-racism video that we put out, and we also have a framework that can be found on our website as well, along with an infographic that basically tells our story and our journey along the way of all the various things that I have just mentioned. So I will stop there.
Thank you. Ms. Woodford, again, you know, from this whole idea of the necessity, from the standpoint of identity and confidence in your future, why is honesty in education important?
In answering that question, I am inclined to consider the importance of intersectionality and recognizing an individual as more than one identity. I'm more than a Black person. I'm more than a woman. I'm both of those things simultaneously and experience disadvantage as a result of both of those identities at the same time in different ways. It's that intersection of disadvantage that makes it difficult for people, women of color, people of whatever intersection of identity. They struggle, and oftentimes, in my experience in the classroom as a high school student, and even at a predominantly white institution in higher education, I don't see educators, I don't see administrators, I don't see people in positions of power who look like me. And I think that's difficult to envision yourself in the future as a leader in a position of authority when you don't see a visual representation of that on a day-to-day basis in your formative years, and understanding, having a guide or a roadmap to being able to ask someone who looks like you, how did you navigate this? How did you go about wanting to become whatever professional? You know, you don't have that point of entry or access. And I think that can disparage some students who are of minority backgrounds and have different identities. So I think in regard to the context of honesty in education, it's important to address that explicitly and say that we should have more people in positions of power who look like you. We don't, and that's as a result of our own fault as a country. That's where the honesty comes in. And then you continue that conversation and go beyond and encourage those students to become the first. I'm in a position in whatever career I choose to become the first Black woman to do something. We're living in 2021, almost 2022. That's ridiculous, but that's the way that it is. I could be the first in my career to become a professional, but we have to acknowledge that in the classroom and say that this is where we're at and explain why we have so much further to go.
Thank you. That's a wonderful segue, because I'd like Dr. Jungkunst to talk about the necessity of open exchange of ideas within the classroom, the soft skills that are needed in life that come out of that. You know, the Dr. Kunz, Jungkunst. Please unmute yourself.
I'm so old school, I forget about the all this stuff, so I'm sorry. It's such an important question, and one that is hard to tackle, because for so long we've been socialized to be dishonest. We've been socialized to not see, to be blind, to turn away. And the anti-critical race theory movement is another attempt to in my view, you know, erase Black lives, erase Black lives, erase the, you know, it's the idea that they don't matter, and it's not a it's normal. This is very much in line with our history, and I think that, so this is very difficult. I think that intersectionality is right. That is the key in so many ways, because it brings about, it can bring about a politics of kindness and empathy. When you think about the ways that these various identities intersect with each other, and kind of they interact and they create each other, and they can create create situations where a person is facing the most daunting of tasks, and they can create situations where a person is not facing much difficulty at all due to their identities. And if we could have conversations around that, that would be important. But part of the problem is that we engage in this sort of back and forth with each other. I mean, I'm in a good position as that, being at higher ed, because, for the most part, it's about open discussion. And you can say many things, but honesty is different. I think that having honesty is going to take some real deep thought and self-reflection among the sort of dominant population, because we have been socialized to be dishonest about who we are, dishonest about, the state of the country at various times. So it's a great question, and it's one that I think is so multi-layered, and each person that's spoken about it has had great responses. I mean, Dr. Celico, all those things you listed were amazing. I mean, those are all actually practical ways for us to be honest. But they're not the norm, but they're in which they were, throughout our educational system. They're amazing. And like in the intersectionality, again, that's a great perspective for us to try and be more honest with each other. I think that, but we're up against a lot,
Thank you. And there is, and I will put this out for the thought while I ask Ms. Woodward a question that I really want covered. But the question after this for everyone's going to be, how do we convince others that systemic racism is real? That comes from our audience. And, and I think that's everyone's frustration. But before we get to that, Kaya, what comes up a lot is the microaggressions and how they impact people. And, when you talked about being Black and a woman, I can talk about being a woman in the 60s and the microaggressions that occurred because I took classes normally men would take in college. But from your standpoint, you're getting it from two different directions. So can you explain to our audience what a microaggression is and the impact it has on you?
Sure. I mean, I think I wouldn't want to define a microaggression in Black and white terminology. I think it more so has to do with the way a remark or comment about an individual makes them feel. I'll give a personal example. This is from middle school. What a time. At a predominantly white school, Bexley High School. I was likely 12, trying to grapple with who I was, who I wanted to be as a Black, soon-to-be woman. I wore my hair down naturally for the first time to school, which is a huge step. You see it here now, but this is years in the making. It takes courage to do that as a Black woman, because we're constantly told your hair is too poofy, your hair is not professional, your hair is an indication that you are different than what is considered to be normal in our society. So I went to school that day, and I remember walking into my science class, and a white boy told me that my hair looked like an umbrella. And I remember my face got so hot and red. I'm sure it looked like a tomato, tears in my eyes. And that's just a seemingly insignificant comment or remark, but it had to do with something I was deeply insecure about. That was the first time I had decided I had enough courage to go to school that day and wear my hair down. And yeah, it does look like an umbrella. But that was devastating for me to hear from the perspective of a peer, a white peer. And I remember I flattened my hair, I put it down. My hair is so damaged at this point because I've just gone over it with a flattening iron to just straighten it, to make it look like other white students who aren't told that their hair looks like an umbrella. So that seemingly insignificant comment, I would define in my personal experience as a microaggression, and it was humiliating for me. And I still to this day struggle with my hair. So there are countless other examples, and microaggressions have a way of making an individual feel as though they should not be content with who they are. And they don't have to be occupying a space that is traditionally reserved for other people. They can just be existing, and pointing out something wrong with who they are and their appearance, or how they talking white, or, not how they're supposed to. That is, it just makes you feel like you don't belong. And I think that's really difficult to grapple with and overcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I understand. Yes. Okay, let's deal with this question from one of our viewers. How do you convince people there is systemic racism? Who would like to jump in on that one?
I'm going to jump in on that because, to me, trying to convince someone that systemic racism exists is like trying to convince someone that Black Lives Matter. Either they're going to believe it or they're not. And this may sound kind of harsh, but to me, time is too important in my life for me to try to convince somebody of something that is pretty obvious. The African-American vice president of the State Board of Education, during our discussion on our resolution, said there was no such thing as systemic racism. So it's not only white people that feel that way. Well, I mean, you saw it on TV. But, I'm not going to try to convince someone. And if you really do want to try to convince someone, I mean, you can show them so many examples of redlining and, segregation and the health disparities. And I mean, the GI Bill, 3,200 white people and 2 Black people. There's so many examples that if somebody can look at those examples, our vice president said it's individuals, it's not systemic. How do you convince somebody like that when it's obvious and it exists? So I'm not going to try to convince them of that. I'm just going to let them go ahead and feel the way they feel. Somebody may feel differently, but if they can't see it, I'm not going to be able to convince them of it. You're muted.
Yes. Anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, how about
could I jump in real quick? I just wanted to
Of course, yes.
Takaya, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's what you is awful, and it's unjust, and it's wrong, and we have a lot of work to do to try and change it. Unfortunately, I think I don't have a lot of faith, but I do want to say I'm sorry. And I watched my wife. She had the same experience of she went natural, it was in the 90s, and the way that people reacted to her and acted towards her. This isn't, I'm not trying to say like a broad generalization about white people, but she would come home. This is when we were in graduate school in Seattle. She would come home at the end of the day and she would be down. And I'd say, "What's wrong?" She said, and I would be like, "What do you mean?" And what it was microaggressions all day long. People coming up and touching her hair, touching it and doing this. Like, what is that? Talking about her green eyes. Are your eyes really green? And
these are important points to deal with an even broader question while we're on this. Many focus the diversity just on race, but it goes beyond race. It goes to a lot of other issues, and to gender fluidity, just so many things. How do you see these issues impacting all forms of social identity, gender identity, even students who are challenged, going beyond race, microaggressions, the honesty in the classroom, basically some of the denial of our society. Anyone want to jump in on that? Poverty is a huge issue, and Dr. Celico, you deal with both the racial and the poverty issues in your district. Anyone?
First, I'd just like to thank you for your apology. You don't have to apologize on behalf of all white people, but from you individually, I appreciate it, and the recognition that it is more than a simple remark, but it affects someone emotionally and how they view themselves, and that's what sticks with you, is your perception of yourself and how you navigate the world after. In regard to your question, I think that we, in our society specifically, struggle to recognize humanity. In specific regard to poverty, our population of people experiencing homelessness is just disparaging, and the way that so many people look through people who are on the street, people who don't have a roof over their head, people who struggle with addiction, they don't see them as people, but they see them as obstacles, someone in the way, something in the way, really. To feel inconvenienced, to acknowledge someone who's on the street asking you for $1 to eat, imagine the position of hardship that they're in. We can't even empathize with that. I think we struggle more broadly to empathize at all. And I think that extends beyond poverty to race. We can't empathize or understand something we don't personally experience, which leads people just to be apathetic and not care at all. And I think that's part of the reason we have seen minimal progress. People just don't get it because they don't care to listen to people who do experience it. They don't have any personal experience themselves. And you can apply that to any identity or socioeconomic position. But those are my thoughts.
I just want to jump in. That's why these two bills are so dangerous, because when students are able to learn about other cultures and to learn what's going on in society, and to learn about the resistance, the resilience, the persistence of resistance of African Americans in history, it builds empathy, not just for children of color, but it also builds empathy from white students who are hearing these stories. And that's why it's so awful that the words that the anti-CRT people and the people who are supporting these bills, that's why it's so sad that they're claiming that white students' feelings are being hurt and that Black students are being made to feel like victims, because it puts the wrong spin on what these bills are actually going to do in the classroom. If we're able to do the kinds of things like dealing with social justice and diversity and equity, that builds empathy. It's just automatic when you hear the stories. And so that's why it's so important that we do all we can to combat these bills.
What a perfect way, Ms. Johnson, to end our session. We are, I'm sorry to say, out of time. We could go on with this discussion for quite a while, and I really thank all of you for your honesty and candid comments. This has been fantastic, a fantastic discussion. But what we want to do right now is basically go back to where we started. And I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia again to talk about how you can help in this fight to protect honesty in our classrooms. Cynthia?
Thank you, Karen. And I want to personally extend my warmest gratitude to each of the panelists, Merle Johnson, Kaya Woodford, Dr. Celico, and Dr. Jungkunst. It was a compelling discussion. Kaya, a huge heart for you. But I want to thank everyone here. We are going to segue over to how, after listening to these personal testimonies and learning about the different issues in the Statehouse, the State Board of Ed, and your local school districts, how you can plug in. In the Statehouse, what's happening right now is we are waiting for the General Assembly to reconvene in September. And in the meantime, what we can do is start writing that opponent testimony. We are anticipating that the State and Local Government Committee will request opponent testimony in the fall or maybe even the winter time, and we won't know until they request it, but we can get that testimony written. We are also asking folks to contact their legislators and the State and Local Government Committee members and explain to them why you do not want these two pieces of legislation to pass. And then you can also be a voice in your area media or the state media. Submit those letters to the editor and op-eds. We do have toolkits for each one of these pieces of action on our LWBO website. And same for the State Board of Education. We are asking people to reach out and contact our State Board of Ed members like Merle Johnson and tell them why you support diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across the state, why you support that strategic plan, why you support diversifying the education profession across Ohio, why you support anti-racism measures across the state, you know, why this is important to you, and why the student voices like Kaya's need to be heard and honored and affirmed. Again, we are asking you to contact your board members. You can also request to offer public comment at the State Board of Education meeting. We do have specific information about how you go about doing that on the website. And then you can submit those letters to the editor and op-eds. And in your local school district, we do encourage you to plug into your district. Reach out, look on the website, contact your school administrators, and find out what kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are going on in your district. And if there aren't any, start some. You can be the voice that gets things moving. Reach out to Kaya. She can tell you how to do it. She led an entire initiative in Beckley about it. Certainly reach out to Dr. Celico as well. She is far ahead of the curve and has been leading this work for years. You heard just the tip of the iceberg about what Dr. Celico has been doing successfully in engaging all of the education stakeholders across the Bedford community. And of course, Merle Johnson, she can, she will lead an army behind you. You tell her where you are at and she will help you do that. And of course, Dr. Youngkunz can also offer you resources as far as that goes. But learn about what's happening in your district. Submit letters to your superintendent and to your school board members saying you would like them to continue those efforts or, of course, initiate those efforts. And go to your local school board meetings. Offer public comment. Public comments are about 3 minutes. You don't have to submit it ahead of time. You can go there and offer public comment impromptu. And then, of course, again, submitting those letters to the editor and the op-eds, our media. That is our stage of where we can have these discussions and where your voice can be heard across the state. If you get into one of the major newspapers, the Dispatch, Dayton Daily News, Cleveland.com, Akron Beacon Journal, the Cincinnati Enquirer, there are several. And again, if you plug into any of the toolkits on the website, it will give you specific information about how to do each one of these actions.
And I'd like to add one more action. This is local elections this year. School board members are up for election. Know what to ask them, ask the questions, make sure they know what you think about protecting honesty in education. I want to thank everyone who participated. Dr. Youngkunz, thank you for your expertise. Your information was excellent. We're getting comments in the chat that it was very much appreciated. As always, Merle Johnson, you were incredible and I love working with you. And I love the work you're doing, especially now with the students you're mentoring. Dr. Celico, you are definitely ahead of the curve in what you're doing in the Bedford City Schools. Keep up the great work, and we will continue to let people know that it is the place to watch. And Kyer Woodford, you are amazing. And thank you so much for sharing your story tonight and being so honest with us. Thank you all. And thank you, Cynthia, for coordinating all of this. And to Michael, who managed our chat for us. Thank you, Michael Barron, and Alice, who so masterfully managed our slides. And thank all of you for attending. Watch for the recording and please take action. This is important. Thank you.